knowing who's on the call today. Thank you. Okay, I think we'll get going, and others may still join. Welcome, Michele. I've just seen you also have joined. So thank you to all of you for joining today's webinar. It's unfortunate we weren't able to meet in person in Niger, but here we are, almost a month later. And we decided we wouldn't manage the multilingual translation when we do virtual webinars. So this is why we are hosting an English one today, and then more or less the same agenda tomorrow in French. And because ALFA Sahel was primarily involves Francophone countries, we may be slightly fewer in today's webinar than tomorrow's, but what we will do eventually is, in addition to posting up the recording of the two webinars, we'll at some point try to combine the outcomes of the French and the English ones, so that everybody gets to hear the wisdom and the thoughts of the other language webinars. So my name's Fiona. I'll be the facilitator today with the CLAR team, and I work for CARE based in Nairobi, and we are co-hosting the ALFA Sahel together with IDRC, and I can see Michele's on the call today as well. It's great. So we've got some interesting things in store for you today, but just quickly in terms of our protocol, I can see everybody's muting, so that's great. If you can keep yourself muted. When there's a point for questions and so on, you are welcome to raise your hand. So you just click on the raise hand button, and then we'll invite you to speak. But what we would like you to do is use the chat box as much as possible, and especially while we have two presentations, and while the presentations are ongoing and at the end of the presentation, please do use the chat box to post your question. And then we will also have space for raising hands and asking questions verbally as well. So I think let's get started. Thank you for introducing yourself already in the chat box. Name, organization, country is great. And then I think let's get going. So we'll just do a bit of introduction, and back to what is the ALFA Sahel 2020 objective, so we can remind ourselves. Our purpose was to generate some collective learning and exploration towards climate resilient and secure livelihoods and landscapes and development in the Sahel and the drier areas of West Africa. And we really want to get into exploring the underlying issues and what the drivers and barriers are, and how we can develop new insights and options for more collective action together around our two main themes of resilient people, recognizing that livelihoods are interconnected across the Sahel, and recognizing the future climate is bringing change that is unexpected and unknown, but also looking at resilient landscapes and how can we manage natural resources in these multi-user landscapes in the Sahel. So the idea with ALFA Sahel was to bring together this whole range of different disciplines and actors in the Sahel in order to explore these ideas, not so much from the perspective of, well, we do this, we've got the best approaches, but more to question ourselves and to learn from each other how we see it from our different disciplines and what might be new ways forward in terms of overcoming some of the major challenges we're facing in the Sahel, and including in the face of future climate. So on this call, on the webinars, we are the same people who signed up to join ALFA Sahel. So we are coming from the different backgrounds, practitioners, researchers, scientists, policymakers. And we'd like to just get a sense of who's on this call and where you feel you belong. So we have a little poll for you. And if you could quickly just pick one of these options and submit, it's great. Just pick one, so we'll get a sense of the balance that we have on the call today. Great. Welcome, whoever's joining just now. We'd like you to pick an option that best describes you. Out of practitioner, NGO, or researcher, scientist, falls in the researcher bracket, or policy decision maker. And if you've just joined, please also introduce yourself in the chat box with your name and organization and country. So we thank you. I think now you can see the outcome of who we are on this call. So not too bad in terms of our balance, and looking forward to hear the different voices from the practitioner, researcher, and policymaker side. So thank you for doing this poll, and we'll move on. So we can stop sharing the results and get into what we're going to be doing in the webinar today. So that we're seeing this as a bit of a first webinar, and we would like to continue with more if people are keen and interested to continue the discussion. So today's webinar theme and agenda are really about setting the scene and understanding what is happening in the Sahel, what has been happening historically, what's happening now, and what looks like it's going to be happening into the future, so that we can have a basis and foundation for our discussions of the bigger questions, and to provide a background for sharing later on, going into more depth on these issues and what we do in our work to address these issues. But today's webinar is really about understanding the issues and discussing what we already know, what our experiences are in terms of the people whose lives depend on the resources in the Sahel and those landscapes and ecosystems that they depend on. So we're going to start with two presentations. One really talking about what's happening up to now, what are the trends we are seeing in terms of changes in people's livelihoods and changes in the way natural resources are being managed. And a second presentation from the science perspective, the climate science perspective, on past and future climate change trends and impacts. And then we're going to actually get into some breakout groups. We have a Zoom function for that. You'll find yourself randomly placed actually into groups, fairly randomly, groups of not more than 4 people, I would say. And we'll give you the guidance on what to do in your groups when we get to that. But we expect to have about 20 minutes for you to have a chat in these small groups of 4 people or so. And then at the end, we'll come back and have a chance to share back from highlights from what you've discussed and have some reflection from a participant we have with us from Wascal. And lastly, gathering up your ideas for next webinars and what we might do going forward from here. So do remember to use the chat box as we get into the presentations now. Write your questions in the chat box to everybody. And welcome also if you have any questions or other issues, or you're having difficulty hearing or something like that, use the chat box to let us know. And otherwise, I'd like to welcome Sebastian Serters to go ahead with our first presentation. Welcome, Sebastian.
Thank you, Fiona. So just quickly, I'm Sebastian and I work for CARE. I'm the Research, Evidence and Documentation Coordinator for a program, the Climate Learning and Advocacy for Resilience program, which is, at least on the CARE side, organizing ALFA Sahel. The aim of this presentation is as Fiona's mentioned, is a kind of scene setting. Just to, we're going to talk about changes happening in terms of the natural resource base in the Sahel. There's 2 disclaimers. One is not all the changes relate to climate change. And the second one is there are many other changes that are not discussed here. But these are at least some of them. Okay, next slide, thanks. So the idea is, we've been, Fiona and I and Sanusi and the CLAR team have been talking about multi-user drylands. The Sahel, like drylands everywhere, is characterized by multiple livelihoods using the same natural resource base for different purposes. So there are farmers and there are pastoralists, there are fishermen and hunters, and all these groups kind of share the natural resource base or make use of the natural resource base in different ways. In the Sahel, what's important is that these livelihoods, these different livelihoods also coincide with existing social cleavages. So for example, pastoralism is a livelihood dominated by Fulani, by ethnic Fulani. Women are very much dominate the collecting of shea nuts. We have landless youth who hunt, and adult male farmers with land rights who are then involved in farming. And together it means that you have competing claims to natural resources, and that these are inherent to drylands, certainly also including the Sahel. And we know also that where governance structures are weak, so that includes also local authorities, chiefs, any institutions responsible for distributing natural resources or regulating access or sanctions for non-compliance or resolving disputes, that where those governance structures are weak, the risk of conflict between different livelihoods may also be high. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is just run through some charts, some figures. I'm not going to go into the details of them. They are on the ALFA Sahel website, which I guess can be put in the chat box. There's a paper there which goes into a little bit more detail on each of these, and this presentation is also posted on that website. So the first is the expansion of cropland from 2000 to 2013. Between 2000 to 2013, there has been a real increase in the expansion of cropland, across all of the Sahelian countries. And this involves, or much of this is about the conversion of unfarmed grazing land into farmland. Much of this is driven by rural population growth, but it should also be noted that in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Mauritania, the rate of annual change, so the rate of change at which, let's say, unfarmed grazing land has been transformed into farmland, exceeds the annual rural population growth rate. So this suggests that it's not only population growth, people are also farming larger areas, And this would be in line with kind of the introduction of new technologies, tractors, which allow people to plow larger areas, weedicides, which allow people to weed larger areas, etc. Next slide. So this one relates to the livestock, and it shows the increase in livestock between 2000 and 2017. So it's a slightly larger. The previous slide was to 2013, which doesn't make that much difference in terms of the overall trend. So there have been significant increases in the number of livestock between 2000 and 2017 in all of the Sahelian countries. And then we did the same kind of check to see, is that just population growth or not? And in Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mali and Niger, the annual rates, the rate of annual increase in livestock exceeds by sometimes up to 3 times the annual rural population growth rate. So this would suggest it's not only more people, it's also that people have larger herds of livestock. So together with the previous slide, and you know, there are certainly more complex things to note, but just as at a very basic level, more cropland, less unfarmed grazing land coupled with an increase in livestock is likely to result in an increase in competition between, let's say, farmers and pastoralists over access to land, access to and use of land. All right, next slide. This one relates to the surface area covered by water, and it's in the years 1975, 2000, and 2013. Here the results look slightly mixed. Some countries have had more, have a larger surface area covered by water, some less. I think what they all have is that between 2000 and 2013, there was a reduction in the area of land covered by water. So the orange line or the orange bar in the charts is bigger than the gray one for all the countries. And it's also important to note that 1975 was, of course, during the Sahelian drought. So that was a really, really bad, period. And that in 2013, in some countries, you see that the surface area covered by water is not that much less than in 1975. All right, next slide, please. And this is the last slide like this. It relates to irrigated farming or dry season farming. And again, in the years 1975, 2000, and 2013, this is seen, dry season farming is sort of seen as a good, I guess, way of having more than one income stream and being less dependent on rainfall. And the chart shows that for all the countries that there have been significant increases in the area of land which is used for irrigated farmland in all of the Sahelian countries. And then just to note that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Mauritania and Senegal have increased by 3 times that area between 1975 and 2013. So I think just taking all the slides together, maybe you have an increase in area being farmed, you have an increase in livestock, you have a reduction in the surface area covered by water between 2000 and 2013, and you have a fairly significant expansion of the area used for irrigated farming. And these changes are just as at a very basic level, likely to result in increased competition over access to and use of land. And this is also kind of a context in which climate change will, the effects of climate change will manifest, but also the context in which policies, programs, and projects which aim to strengthen resilience are sort of are implemented. All right, next slide. So this is the incidence of conflict, and it shows the monthly average per year for the years 2015 to 2019. It's from a data set from an ACLED, I forget what it stands for, but it's funded by the World Bank and a number of donors. And it shows significant increases in the average monthly incidence of conflict for each of the years and for the 4 countries that we selected. Burkina Faso has shown the most significant increase. In 2019, there were 102 incidents of conflict per month. But you know, the rapid increases in Burkina Faso should also not sort of disguise that in Niger and Chad looks much smaller, but those would be significant increases where Mali and Burkina Faso were not on the graph. So in Niger, there were 6 incidents per month in 2017, and in 2019, 44 incidents of conflict per month. So those are significant increases that we see really across the Sahel. This chart is looking at conflict in relation to and comparing it with the rainfall. So the bars, the blue bars, are the average monthly incidents. So in January 2015, in January 2016, 17, 18, and 19, that's the average number of conflicts. The orange line is the average precipitation. So we know that June, July, August, September are rainy months, and in January and December there is much less rain. Just to also say, this is for Burkina Faso, and we could do the same thing for other Sahelian countries and come with kind of similar results. And then what you see, the black dotted line is the trend line for conflict. So it's the trend line for the blue bars. And what you see is that there are spikes in conflict before and after the rainy season. And it's important to kind of note that there is potentially a kind of seasonal dynamic to conflict, that it relates in some way to either rainfall or maybe sowing or harvesting periods or both, because it suggests that climate change will at least have some impact or is in some way related to indirectly to kind of conflict patterns or annual conflict patterns. Next slide. Okay, and just zooming in, here are 2 examples of sort of more livelihood orientated things that we have taken from care programming, baselines from care projects in different countries. And just to say that there would be loads of these. We've selected 2 because we have a fairly good kind of data set, but there would be many, you know, there are many things happening that we see happening in the Sahel, changes that are happening kind of organically, and these are just 2. The first one comes from a project in Niger, a care project in Niger, where pastoralists were asked about changes in mobility patterns over a 30-year period. So the pie chart on the top left is mobility patterns 30 years ago, perceived at least. And I think the major thing to highlight between, and the one at the bottom right is today, and the major changes is the cross-border mobility, that 14% that said that was the main pastoral mobility pattern 30 years ago, and 60% say that today. And that kind of aligns with the idea that pastoralists need to travel further to be able to get the resources that they need. The adaptive capacities on the right, farmers, agro-pastoralists and pastoralists were asked first if they'd experienced a climate shock, and then secondly if they'd regained losses after a climate shock. And what's important to note, I guess, here is that at the top, the yes is the orange, so 45, and so agro-pastoralists were most likely to have experienced the climate shock. And then if you look at the bottom chart, if people had felt that they'd recovered those losses, agro-pastoralists were also the most likely to say that they'd either partially or entirely been able to recover losses. And this sort of also aligns with ideas about having multiple income streams, or at least being able to hedge risks across different livelihoods. And we do see, I think, a movement towards this kind of livelihood, agropastoralism. All right, next slide. Okay, so just to summarize, that I hope what is clear is that there is pressure on natural resources in the Sahel is coming from different and yet interconnected livelihoods. And they make use of the available natural resources in different ways, and that makes it complicated to govern. As the pressure on natural resources increase and the impacts of climatic change worsen in the Sahel, and there's a presentation after this one on climate forecasts, the capacities of different livelihood groups to negotiate the use of and access to productive natural resources is likely to become increasingly stressed. Data shows increases in conflicts, and this is also intuitively, we know this is clear, that there are seasonal dynamics to conflicts, not all of the conflicts in the Sahel, but there is certainly some sense of conflicts related to different seasons. And then finally, livelihoods and vulnerabilities are changing in the Sahel in dynamic ways, driven by many factors, including the changing natural resource base, competing demand for natural resources, changing climate variability and climate market prices, conflict, and more. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sebastian. I just need to mention my connection's not great, so please, if you can't hear me, at least throw something in the chat box. But thanks, Sebastian. And as you've heard, we do have clear evidence that things are changing, but they're changing in complicated ways for different people in the Sahel. We know that in the region that we are concerned about, we have a whole diverse range: the farmers, the agropastoralists, the pastoralists, different ethnic groups, all sorts of different types of vulnerable people within communities, from older people, women, men, youth. It's very diverse, and clearly there's a lot of vulnerabilities that people are facing already in terms of climate, in terms of conflict, in terms of changes of land use, access, land degradation. So one of the things that we're looking at in our ALFA Sahel webinars and in the the sharing that we are looking for is not to necessarily answer the questions. I can see a very good question: how are we going to solve the problem of conflict between herdsmen and farmers? I don't think we can answer that question today, but what we want to do is to explore that question and go deeper into what are the underlying issues and challenges that are facing us, that are leading to this conflict and leading to other vulnerabilities that people have. And then ultimately, yes, how can we support people in the Sahel to collectively manage their ecosystems and manage the climate risks they're facing, the conflicts they're facing? How can we help them to sustain their livelihoods and regenerate the scarce resources they're relying on without recourse to competition and conflict? And to start thinking about the drivers and barriers and what other challenges we might have to think about. So these are all questions for all of us, and thank you, Sunday, for raising your question. Please, others, put your questions in the chat box if you have them, but just flagging that question from Sunday is a question to all of us, and I think the answer can emerge eventually from the discussions that we need to all have together and the learning that we have together. I don't think there's any one answer or any one expert, but by putting our heads together and trying to go a bit deeper into, well, what are these dynamics and drivers and barriers that are reflected in what Sebastian, the changes Sebastian just presented to us. I'm not seeing more questions in the chat box, and in the interest of time, I'd like us to move on. So now we've heard what's been in the past. what we want to do now is understand, okay, how does those past trends up to date reflect in relation to how the climate has been changing in the past and up to date, and then go further and look into the future. What does the science tell us about what we might be expecting into the future in terms of climate change, and the risks that we may be facing in terms of the climate change impacts into the future. So I'd like to welcome Kofi Asare to take us through the second presentation.
Thank you, Fiona.
You're welcome. Go ahead.
As Arias was mentioned, I work with the Ghana Space Science Technology Institute, and I also work as the principal coordinator for Rainwatch Africa. And I'll be presenting on climate change. And the African continent depends directly and indirectly on the climate than any other region in the world. So the perceived changes, or what the changes that we are experiencing today, are going to really impact on our livelihood. And that's why there's a need for us to deepen our understanding so that we appreciate what we are experiencing now and what we're going to experience in the future, and position ourselves very well to avoid the implications or bring them to the minimum barest level. So I'm going to give you a picture regarding our past up to our present to know what has been happening in terms of temperature, that is the night and day temperature, and also give a picture regarding our rainfall pattern over the past years to the present. And then I'll further take you into the future for us to know what we should expect so that we can position ourselves very well to explore the opportunities that it presents to us, and also build our resilience and adaptive capacity to be able to face the challenges that may be ahead. And this will be done through the various climate models that have been run to give us such results. I also highlight to you some uncertainties so that as you use this information, you also take the needed precautions. Thank you. Next slide. So it is indeed true that the global climate has changed. Temperatures are increasing, rainfall patterns are increasing in certain areas and decreasing in certain areas. But what affects us is not the global picture. What affects you and me is what we experience in our countries, in our regions, in our districts, in our communities. What we experience at that level is what affects our livelihoods as a farmer, as agro-pastoralist, or whatever livelihood activity you are engaged in. So the focus for this presentation will be on the Sahelian region. Next slide. Next slide, please. So when we talk about climate, the emphasis is on temperature and also on rainfall. Temperatures basically would give us the picture of how warm our day is, that is the maximum temperature, or how cold or warm our night is, that is the minimum temperature. And when you analyze from the past, from 1950 to the present, you will notice that both night and day temperature has been on the increase till date. Our nights are increasing at a higher rate compared to our day. And when you also look at the year, you will notice that from the first day of the year to the last day of the year, you will notice that temperature is increasing. So if you look at the graph on your screen, you notice that the graph that is beneath is showing an increasing trend. And from 1950 to date, there has been about 1.1 degrees Celsius change in temperature. And regarding temperature, though it is just 1.1, that is quite significant. That will have really impact on their livelihood activities. But again, this gives us the annual picture for each year. But again, you also will notice from the graph on the top, that focuses on the month April. For that particular month, the temperature increase from 1950 to present has been 1.4 degrees Celsius. So I want to highlight to you that throughout the year, temperature is increasing, but because of the seasons that we have, the dry season and the wet season we experience over the Sahelian region, you also will notice that if you go further deep, the dry season's temperature is also increasing at a higher rate compared to the rainy season. So our dry season is becoming more warmer compared to the rainy season, though the rainy season is also becoming warmer as well. So you notice that there, instead of 1.1 degrees Celsius, it's about 1.4 degrees Celsius. So temperature within the region is increasing. Next slide, please. Again, if you want to look into the future, you will notice that the situation is not changing. The future climate temperature is also increasing. Scientists are able to run various models using various algorithms to be able to tell us what we should expect in the future based on the various climate emission scenarios. It is evident that human activities are also contributing to the high temperatures we are experiencing during the night and also during the day. And therefore, those scenarios have been captured. I want to advise that your activities will impact on our climate, and therefore, when you are engaging on the various activities, let it be environmentally friendly so that it doesn't increase the warming we experience now. But importantly, all the emission scenarios, all the climate models are telling us that our future from today going would also continue to be warmer and warmer. Our nights are going to be warmer, our days are going to be warmer. If nothing changes, this is what we should expect. And again, if you look at the graph on your left-hand side, you notice that those of us, the African continent is warming at a higher rate compared to that of the sea. What interests us is also the Sahelian region. And you will notice that the temperature across the Sahelian region on the African continent is also on a higher side, and that should catch our attention. So overall, we are expecting about 1.5 to 4 degrees Celsius increase in our temperature. In other words, we should expect between 1.5 to 4 degrees Celsius change in our day temperature and also in our night temperature. Temperature is going to increase going forward into the future. Next slide. Having given the picture regarding temperature, how warm and how cold our nights and day will be, we want to focus also on rainfall pattern over the Sahelian region from the 1950 to also present. You notice from the graph on the top right-hand side that from the early 1950s to the 1970s, the graphs are pointing upwards. That means that rainfall within that period, over a decade, was above average. In other words, those years were very wet. We had a lot of rainfall for that period. And you also even notice that for those periods where the graphs, the bars are pointing upwards, some of the bars are longer than others. So it tells us that even within that period, some years were more wetter compared to other years. So when you shift from that part to beyond the 70s to 90s, you notice that the graphs are not pointing upwards again. Suddenly, they are all pointing downwards, which also means that for those periods, rainfall was below average. In other words, those years were drier compared to the long-term average. And you also will notice from the bars pointing downwards that some of the bars are longer or taller than others. So dryness were also not the same. Some years were more drier compared to some years. So if you look at the 80s, the mid-80s, 83, 84, 85, you will notice that the bars there are quite longer. It tells you that those years were much more drier compared to the other dry years. Moving beyond from beyond the 90s, you notice the pattern has changed. The graphs are not just pointing upwards or pointing downwards as compared to the previous. Some years the graphs are pointing downwards, some years the graphs are pointing upwards. It also tells us that some years in recent times are wetter, and some years in recent times are drier. And this gives us even a challenge. It is difficult to manage such a situation. When you know you are having a wet situation, you know the direction you are going. If you know it is just dry, you know the direction you are going. But where you have a situation where is the mixture of the two, makes management also difficult and also presents you some kind of risks that requires thinking strategies to manage them. Next slide, please. So that was for the his past to the present. Going to the future, what is the storyline? From the various models run by scientists, the results are also showing that within the Sahelian region, looking at the map on your left-hand side, the green areas are showing areas where there will be much rainfall. And the brown to dark side, that is towards the western part of the Sahelian region, Senegal and the other areas, are also going to be drier. So within the Sahelian region, our experiences are going to be different. It's not going to be the same. Where some parts, the central towards the east, are expected to be more wetter, towards the west, we are expecting more drier conditions. This also brings to us some implications. Those in the wetter situation are likely to have, while they are likely to have more rainfall, they would experience drought, but their drought may not be as pronounced compared to those in the dry areas. Their seasons may be shorter, but might not be as short as those in the dry areas. The onset of the season, the cessation of the season, the wet experiences will present a different situation. Whereas those in the dry area would also have a different situation. They may have more pronounced wet, drier conditions. But across all, I want to point out that each of these scenarios at the west, at the east, there will be dry conditions, but they will be different depending on your location. There will be floods in these areas, but it will be different depending on your location. And if temperatures continue to increase even beyond 2 degrees, the picture may even be different, may even be worse, looking at our sub-region. Next slide, please. Going further.
Kofi, you have about maximum 5 minutes left.
Well, thank you. Again, there is going to be more intense rainfall events in our sub-region, which will mean that there will be, we should expect more floods within the sub-region. There will be days of heavy rainfall events. And heavy rainfall events may also trigger and give us droughts and floods. And we should also position ourselves to expect this as well. Next slide, please. So giving you a summary of our past, temperatures night and day has been warming up for about 0.6 to 1 degree Celsius from 1970 to 2010. Our nights are becoming warmer as well as our days. And then also, we are having a high or increased frequency in rainfall event, which is also leading us to having more experiences of flood conditions in our sub-region. There are also year-to-year variations in our rainfall. Some years are dry, some years are wet. In the west of the Sahelian region is becoming more drier compared to the eastern part. And then we are having shorter rainy season and having a longer dry season. Next slide, please. When you look at the future, as I've indicated, our nights and days are becoming more warmer and warmer, and we are expecting between 3 degrees to about 6 degrees increase in temperature. Those at the coast would experience lesser increase, about 3 degrees Celsius, but those in the inland, Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso, and the rest would experience about 4 degrees Celsius increase or more. Again, our nights and our days are going to be more hotter and hotter. Our seasons, rainfall season is also going to be shorter, whereas our dry season is going to be longer. Again, regarding our coast, there will be sea level rise for the countries within the Sahel along the coast, expecting about 14.4 centimeters rise in the sea level and up to about 40 centimeters by the year 2001. All these projections given are embedded in them are uncertainties. Scientists do not have 100% understanding of our climate system. We are using mathematical calculation and algorithms. There's lack of data, historical data, all put together comes with uncertainty. So we are also advising that make use of this information, but be aware that there are uncertainties within, and scientists will continue to update this information for you to have the current information. And again, I will recommend that you always link up with the climate institutions in your respective countries for regular updates. Next slide. The impacts and the risks that it poses to us are also enormous, depending on where you are and the situation you're going to experience. There's evidence that within the Sahelian region, as you can see from the map on your screen, the Sahelian region are dominated by the red color. There's going to be decline in yields, and therefore you must take precaution, but not only in the agri sector, those in agro-pastoralists and other livelihood activities are also going to be hit. We need to discuss these issues and position ourselves, bearing in mind these challenges, so that we can build our adaptive capacity, be more resilient, be able to explore the opportunities and position ourselves for the better future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kofi. Kofi Asare is from the Ghana Space Science and Technology Institute, but I'd also like to acknowledge the group that put these slides together. Yusuf Sane, who will be presenting the same tomorrow in French from Anasim, joined up with Kofi to put the presentation together, and drew strongly from AMA 2050, which is a Future Climate for Africa program in West Africa that have been studying the longer term historical and future projections. So Emma and Chris, who are also on the call, thanks so much for your inputs. And just so that participants know, this is not just Kofi's opinion. This is very much a product from quite a lot of science that's been going on in the last few years, supported through a few projects. Also the Rainwatch Alliance, as Kofi mentioned at the beginning, that he's also working on together with the Walker Institute and Reading University. So thank you so much. I'm seeing just one question on the climate presentation in the chat box, and maybe also I think a few people joined while the presentations were going on. If you haven't already introduced yourself in the chat box, please do, and put, tell us who you are and your organization, the country where you are. And we're using the chat box, so for everybody. Also, if you have more questions, please do use the chat box. We've got a very few minutes just now to address questions. So if you want to ask a question, you can use the raise hand. There's a raise hand option. You can raise your hand, but at this point, let's keep them as questions to the presentations, because we're going to, in the group work, we'll have a chance to really have discussion. And I'm also seeing lots of interesting debate has already begun in the group chat, so that's great. Questions can also be answered and discussed in the group chat. So thank you to those of you who are already contributing there. And maybe Kofi, while you're still on the floor, so to speak, we have one question from Angelica, which says, and maybe this question was answered later in your presentation, but she's asking, there are models on different increase and decrease in temperature and rain in Western Sahel and Eastern Sahel, and do you have explanation on this as well?
Okay, thank you very much for your question. Like I indicated earlier, there are different emission scenarios looking at our activities from today. So different models are using these different emission scenarios. The inputs of the various models may also differ from one another. And therefore, we expect reasonable differences in these models and their predictions into the future. And therefore, we are aware of these differences. And that's why I highlighted the issue of about uncertainty. Each of these models are presenting the best to the ability now to us, but they also keep on working to improve their predictions. And that's what I'm saying. This is not the end. There's going to be regular updates. And I'm hoping that going into the future, the differences between the models will continue to be narrow so that we will all be pointing towards the same direction. So yes, it's true, but the bigger picture is what we should expect with the affirmation that parts will be increasing. That's the eastern part, and then the western part would also be experiencing a decrease. But in terms of the margins, they may differ, but you should keep in mind of these differences from the west to the east. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kofi. I'm not seeing any hands raised, so use the option to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Looking at the chat box, I can see that what's going on in the chat box is very much related to conflict and resilience. One thing just to clarify, our ALFA Sahel discussions, we want to really look at the picture of peoples whose livelihoods depend on natural resources in the Sahel. And yes, all the different dynamics and external forces that are affecting them. But we are more keen to look at what's happening in relation to the natural resource base and access and use, competition, degradation, improvement, collaboration around natural resource management and use, and people's livelihoods and food security and resilient livelihoods out of this. So our interest is really exploring those complex dynamics. And I see Sunday is keen to look at the larger forces around terrorism, radicalization, and terrorist type conflict. I'd like to maybe just make a request that we try to not go down that road in terms of directly addressing what do we do around politically motivated terrorism, but that we rather stick to the debate around the bigger picture of the sort of long term in terms of climate resilience and natural resource management drivers and barriers around people's ability to make a livelihood without getting into the whole discussion of radicalization, politicization, if that's okay, because I think we have a lot to do and a lot to learn around the work that we're engaged in that relates more directly to how do we adapt to climate change, how could the climate science that we've listened to become useful and usable for the people who are working in the Sahel, and what is that bigger picture future around the food security and livelihood and ecosystem resilience. But thanks for all these questions. Anyway, I think a lot of that debate and question, let's bring that into the group discussions. Let me just read from Chris, who has an answer, I think, to some of the climate questions. So I'll just read that one out. On uncertainty in climate, there are some aspects where uncertainty is high and some where it's low. So we are very confident that temperatures will continue to rise and we expect to trend towards more intense storms into the future across the Sahel. But there's much more uncertainty about the overall annual rainfall trends. And the maps that Kofi presented showing the most likely scenario, but it might still get wetter in the west or central Sahel and not see an increase. So overall, we do know that the future of climate in the Sahel it's very uncertain, but likely that extremes will get bigger and temperatures will rise, which will also have an impact on those extremes and on the value of the rainfall that does fall, presumably. We're not presenting any slides in the presentations on, so what does that mean for the people who are living and working and in the Sahel and depending on the natural resources there. But we do know that whatever the trends have been up to now, climate change impacts are going to increasingly have a more severe impact on those livelihoods. And we're also very sure that all of you who are participating on the call have a lot of experience and knowledge of what that actually looks like. So I'm seeing just another question around how do we make climate information readily available for use by farmers? How can we help small producers in this climate-related uncertainty? How much do we know about changes in the historical and future climate and impact on different marginalized groups? So if it's okay with everybody, anyone who has answers to those questions, please do put them in the chat box. But otherwise, I think we're going to move on now into the group discussions, and you'll have an opportunity to really explore into, so what does this mean? We are not, we're hoping in future webinars to get into questions like using our approaches and solutions, for example, the last question on making climate information available. In this webinar, we still want to deepen our understanding of what's happening, why is it happening, how is it impacting on people, what are the underlying issues. So I'd like you to really look into the questions you can see on the slide. And Aurelie will post this 10 minutes to share highlights on key points that came out from your discussion and see where that takes us. And then I'm going to invite Oblenea to give some reflections from Wascal perspective at the end of the sharing. What I would like everybody to do also, if you are happy to, is in addition to sharing highlights verbally, from your group discussion, if you could post your key points into the chat box as well, that'll make it easier for us to have the recording. So that would be great. Otherwise, let me, maybe the best way to do this is if you are a spokesperson for one of the groups and you are ready to share from your group, could you raise your hand? Or rather, all of you who are going to share in the plenary, could you do the raise hand option? And then I can see who you are. I'm not seeing any. Aha, Angelica. Would you like to go ahead, just unmute yourself and share with us just the key highlights for a minute. And then we'll go to Sakile, and then to Emma, and then we'll go on from there. Angelica.
Yeah, I have put them in PowerPoint, but it's not well structured and nicely. Shall I just copy and paste what I have on the one slide to the chart?
You can.
Yes, but first of all, just speak. Yeah, I think do that, but you're welcome to just talk us through quickly for a minute, and then when you are done, then you can put it in the chat box. That would be fine. Yeah.
So we have been thinking, what should we do, or what will happen with all what we learned. So we see there's an increase in need with the population growth, with more demand, but we have a lower production. But we saw also that there is there may be, for some places, more rain, more runoff. Then we need, while there is more water available, or what is available in a short time, we need a better irrigation system, a more water efficient irrigation system. We need other livelihood activities in the dry season. Also to this alternative livelihood activities in the dry season has to be more productive than the seasonal labor in town, because this is what they're doing now. And then the manpower is not available to do the improvement, to have the runoff used, to do any stone lines. You barely find any young men being available because they are going to town. And then you have women and elderly men, and they are not doing the needed improvements there. So we need there something more productive while we ask them to do this. While we look on the pastoralists, they are moving further distances and they have to be more flexible. So maybe the geo information system to change the itinerary, where to go, is a good solution to give them a good advice to use the natural resources available in the most efficient way. While we look in the problems we will have, is erosion. If we are not doing a good runoff management, there will be more droughts, higher temperatures. We can have increased pest, but we can also have a decrease in pest. Actually, while we look on other diseases like malaria, maps already there to see how the diseases are shifting, how they are moving up in the mountains, why they are moving out from wet areas because they are getting drier, and then also malaria is less frequent. So these changes we have also in pests and diseases for animals. And one point was also to look that we need more drought-resistant crops, that we should also be introduce more alternative activities. And in essence, we have to be very flexible in innovation and not think that we arrived. Now I have improved seeds, that's it. No, I have improved seeds, they are fine for this season. Maybe next season or in 2 years, I have again to change my seeds because it's getting again drier. So we will be in a constant move for technical innovation, in a constant change for more water efficiency, better technologies. We have then really to work hard to be on top of the challenges we are facing.
Thank you, Angelica. Thank you very much. That was at least 2 minutes. So if we can ask the next ones if you can try in less time than Angelica. Let's move straight to Sakile. Sakile, you're welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. So we said that the impact of climate change would obviously include the reduction in the natural resources that are available to the communities, a decrease in the yield of crops, the fodder, water availability, and also we can be losing animals due to death. Increase also in conflicts within the community, which is a result of the other two. And then in terms of the underlying issues or challenges for the long-term climate resilience, there was mention of a lack of understanding on climate change issues among populations and the signs that show the climate change, and also a communication problem between scientists and communities, different languages. The language used by scientists is not understandable to local communities. And then also there's a challenge where we need to merge the indigenous knowledge systems or community knowledge systems and the scientific knowledge systems to create a kind of a hybrid system that can be used to better improve adaptation. So also there are different timescales. Scientists are talking about projections that are 30 years or so. Policymakers think 5 years. So just that different timescale is what affects or is an issue, a challenge for the long-term climate change adaptability. And the other thing is poverty as well. Poverty prevents the local population from taking advantage of the available climate information. For example, they've limited access to technologies, both for adaptation and for knowledge and for having the information. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Akile. Yeah, little pictures beginning to emerge. Emma, please go next. Thank
Stephen.
you. Okay, Stephen, that's fine. And then Emma after Stephen. Yeah, Stephen, go ahead.
So we agree that there is increased drought because there is a lot of intermittent rainfall caused by climate change. So a lot of growers' crops are failing. We also agree that there is a lot of soil loss due to erosion, desertification, increase in farmland areas. We agree water resources are depleting because of climate change. Then one of the things, underlying things we realize that we need to do in terms of addressing all these challenges, which is caused by climate change, which various speakers have highlighted, is to build capacity and create awareness within the communities so that they can better adapt to the climate variabilities that is happening. In terms of capacity, for example, just the last speaker said, if a farmer has an improved variety, he thinks he can continue to use that improved variety over many cropping seasons. But if you build the capacity and create awareness that there is the need for you to change the variety over a certain number of cropping seasons, then the farmer is better adapted to the climate variabilities that we are observing. We also saw that one of the challenges with even the current urbanization is due to climate change, where many youth who are supposed to go into agriculture in countryside are moving to the cities because they are not sure of how their crops will perform, even if they should undertake that venture. So these are underlying issues that is caused by climate change. And then we feel that when we are able to build a lot of capacity around these issues and able to create a lot of awareness, we'll be able to create a lot of adaptation to climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Let's move straight on to Emma. And then after Emma, I think that's the last group. Orally, you'll let me know if there's another group. But after Emma, if that's the last group, I'll also open the floor to anyone who was participating in any of the discussions where you feel that you have more to add from the discussion that your spokesperson didn't address, which is different from what's been said by others so far. So any other additional points, we'll open the floor for that. But Emma, please do go ahead.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion in our group. And we were really looking again at this question about what do we really know about how climate change impacts on different groups, different marginalized groups. We started by thinking about the fact that climate change will affect the nutritional value even of existing crops. But then we quickly turned to thinking about both the fact that there are what are called climate resilient projects that are not appropriately informed by understanding of the use of land and livelihoods, and the fact that there are policies, major national policies, that are not appropriately informed by current understanding of the science. So there were specific examples of that. And so then we talked about, okay, so we do need to have an evidence base, and how much do we really know about how the climate affects different groups in different regions and contexts. And I think there's obviously, it's only a small group, but we were talking about the fact that people are often working on anecdotal evidence or kind of small project information from a small project area. And the fact that we really need to not just do new research, but first of all, even collect what research there exists already, so that can better inform efforts to address climate-related issues. So there's obviously a lot of existing research within and on the region that is not so accessible. So thinking about all the master's students, PhDs, all the huge amounts of work and research that are done by people within the region that are not at the moment informing policy, and how we only got to the point of recognizing that, but then thinking about, how can we collect this so that we can better access it and use it for having better policies and approaches to address climate issues. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Emma. Thanks. So yeah, let me just sort of open the floor. So if you would like to add a point, if you feel your spokesperson didn't cover everything and there's something important that needs to be said, then there's a few moments now you can raise your hand and let us know. So even if you've put it in the chat box, but you'd like to share, then raise your hand. I'm not seeing, well, is Emma, I can see your hand still up, but maybe that's from before. Did you want to add something?
No, that's just me being
No,
inept.
Right,
yeah.
Right, okay, that's fine, that's no worries. Well, while you're thinking, the group I was in, I think, yeah, I would just like to add one of the points that came up, and I didn't hear it from others, was that you know, we do know a fair amount about the vulnerability of different crops to temperature and rainfall, and that there are some very key staple crops that are more vulnerable than other crops, and there are farmers whose whole livelihoods are based around those staple crops that are already, we learned from Chris, we're already seeing 10 to 20% reduction in yields. So it's not just, you know, in 2050 that we're going to see that. But at the same time, the people who are dependent on these crops and facing these decreases are also already struggling with the crises they're already facing in the Sahel, which have always been there, the droughts in particular, and food crisis emergencies. So big question then, how do we transform food systems over the long term? How do we support the diversification? Yes, we're seeing some diversification and some the urbanization people talked about, and also maybe more mixed crop livestock systems. But when people are already down, what would be the first step to enable people who have limited resources and time and labor and thinking capacity to actually start on that road of working to future resilience? So I'm still not seeing hands. Sebastian. Sebastian, go ahead.
I didn't hear it mentioned by any of the groups. Maybe it's someone did mention it, but I think there's a sort of interesting, I guess, intersection between climatic change on the one hand and then sort of degradation or, you know, I guess an eroding of the natural resource base on the other. There have been some studies on, you know, how communities understand climate change, and it's often it's internal, that people say, well, the reason it's happening is because we cut all the trees down for charcoal, or but anyway, that there may be some sort of yeah, some opportunity there. I think, I don't know, it just wasn't mentioned so much, and I think that that's of course like an additional sort of factor making people vulnerable, or sort of together with climate change increasing vulnerability.
Thanks, Sebastian. I'm not seeing more hands, so maybe just, I mean, one of my observations, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for your participation, for all the things that are coming into the chat box, which is fantastic. And I'm afraid I can't read all of this, but it's there for all of us. We will have the recording of the webinar, but also what's in the chat box. You can also copy paste if you like from in there. But thank you really for the participation and we had very little time, far too little time, but already lots of different and important issues coming up. What interested me, two things that interested me. One, that the discussion now looking at these issues in the face of a future climate change, there was very little mentioned in the feedback from the groups about conflict. while that's clearly a major issue, and we've got quite a lot in the chat box about it, but interesting that that was not the first thing that came up when we start talking about the impacts of future climate change, whereas there will for sure be a dynamic between those impacts and future conflict, and how do we turn it around from being generating or inciting more conflict because of more competition over scarcer resources. Is there ways to turn that around towards more adaptive capacity and understanding trade-offs and how to collaborate and coordinate rather than compete? So that was interesting that conflict didn't come up quite so much. We jumped more into the technical issues. The second interesting observation I had from the feedback was that we jumped very quickly into solutions. And I think that's what we do, that's our profession. And so it's, I guess, difficult to not jump into solutions, but just an interesting observation that when we get to trying to unpack and really explore what's actually happening, what do we know, what are the underlying issues, it's very difficult not to start proposing what we could do about it. So we do already have some great ideas, I think, in terms of the different things that researchers need to do around evidence-based, that practitioners need to do around water resource management and diversification and adaptive capacity building. So thank you all of you. I'd like now to ask Oblenea, who's with us from Wascal, but please introduce yourself, Oble, to share your reflections from your work across the region, which is very much about science policy interface, but also the application of science in the West Africa region, the Sahel region. And so your reflections from your perspective from Wascal, and in relation to the discussion questions and what you've been hearing from the presentations and the feedback from the groups so far. Oble, you're welcome.
Thank you, Fiona. Good morning, everybody. So, as Fiona said, I'm Oblenea, scientist at Wascal Competence Center in Burkina Faso. Actually, I have my own background in natural resource management as a rural development engineer. But I was lucky to be along the way also in charge of policy making at the Ministry of Scientific Research of Burkina. So I'm very interested in the interface between science and policy for things, I would say 7 to 8 years now. So of course, what I heard from the presentation as well as for the discussion is very interesting. I think the participants capture most of the issue. But what I will add on that, particularly regarding how science is seen by policymakers, how it's used in the region, is that most of the scientific data sometimes talk about global change, particularly for climate issues. And this focus of the lack of specific data related to West African region, talking about models and so on, sometimes limit really the use of this data, because as most of you know, West Africa is well known for its huge diversity in ecosystems and a lot of variability for most of the climate parameters, which make it really very difficult sometimes to apply some of the general models of knowledge to what is, to apply to the reality on the ground. At Wascal, that's what we realize as a main challenge in terms of bringing science to end users such as farmers or even policymakers. That's one of the issues. The second issue is the funding of the different research activities. I'm surprised that none of the group actually mentioned it, because if somebody is funding a research, it means that the person is funding it by purpose. And what we know is that in most of the Sahelian countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, there is very few or even non-funding coming particularly from the public sector or the private sector to support research, which depicts somehow in the use of the result coming out of this research. Because if you are not at the beginning of the research question formulation, it's not sure that the result that will be get out of this research will meet the needs of people on the ground here. So this is an important issue for us, that we think that we should really work on it to make sure that what research is doing is really what also decision makers in the population need. And for this reason, we have somehow to contribute to the funding of this activity. Another issue, I think that the first group, the second, the group in which I was, mentioned it somehow. It's also the different in scales. I mean, particularly for policy makers and decision makers, usually they're in cabinet for a limiting time. And when you talk about science and you make projection for, let's say, 50 years or 30 years or even 100 years ahead, I start to think, oh, is this really something for me? Because I'm sure that, yeah, right now at cabinet today, but in 5 years, I'm even not sure I'm going to win election. So why should I focus or should I bother about something that will happen in 50 years? So this is also one of the issues which is not really helping the uptake of science by policymakers and some of particularly the politicians. So I think, as you said, we couldn't avoid in the discussion to jump to solutions. But before going to solution, I think that there was something mentioned by Emma. Is the solution really lying on new research, or should we make use already of what is existing? And the issue even is, do we even know what is existing? Because she mentioned, for instance, some of the master theses or even PhD theses. I mean, people do it just for their diploma. And after they got their diploma themselves, they don't know even the document, where it is. So don't talk about people who will use the content or the result of these studies. It's clear and obvious that there is a fantastic, rich documentation and knowledge, particularly in the Sahel region, through the different studies that are really applicable to the different ecosystems and particular zones. But the issue is that so far there is a weak capitalization of all this existing data and scientific knowledge, which is really limiting the use actually in practice by the population to enhance their resilience to climate change. So these are the few key points that we think that when we come to solution, we have really to think carefully about these issues and try to propose our solution to change or to improve the situation along these lines. I will stop here for now. And if there is more time or a reply on this point, I will come back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oble. We have not much time left and a couple of things to get through. But if anybody has a reaction or a question also to Oble or to anything that's gone before, you can have a few seconds now if you raise your hand. Otherwise, please use the chat box, and I'm happy to see people are still putting things in the chat box, and everything that goes in the chat box and in the recording will be very helpful as we move forward, because today is not just a one-off in terms of these kind of discussions. There's no way we are going to unpack all the issues and understand everything and solve everything in a couple of hours. So this is really just getting us whetting the appetite, getting us started. And one of the things I've really appreciated so far is that that we have managed to have the mix of practitioners who are also people working right on the ground, as well as in different disciplines, and scientists and researchers and policymakers, and it really does enrich the discussion. And I would love it for us to go ahead. So may I suggest just keep using that chat box, and we'll move on to actually towards closing the webinar, but we still have some more questions for you. And one of them is, would we like to do more webinars and interaction? And if so, what are your priority topics? Bearing in mind this is about collective learning and sharing and discussing and trying to explore further. We're not yet at the point of deciding to do projects together or something like that. But today we've tried to lay this foundation and just get some of the things out in the open. And clearly it's complicated, it's complex. The future is even more complicated and complex because it's very uncertain. There's lots of different dynamics and drivers and barriers going on. So if you would like to continue having further webinars on the sort of ALFA Sahel series, what would be your priority topics? And we've come up with some options, and there's going to be a poll in a minute. And in that poll, you can pick up to 3 different things. If you pick the last one, which is number 9 of other, please put in the chat box what that other thing is. And otherwise pick any 3 that you can see that you would really like to spend more time learning from others, sharing your work, or discussing and going into the issues. So you have some minutes until everybody's managed to do your voting. Okay, so thank you everybody. I think almost everybody, thank you very much, filled in this. So we have a winner. What works and what does not for practice and research in climate resilience. That's actually very good that is a top winner at this point in our series, because one of the things we had planned for the original ALFA Sahel event was a marketplace to allow for certain people to share their experiences. And we'd actually identified from the registration information a number of people who we'd invited already to do some sharing in the marketplace. And I have gone back to those people in the last week or so to invite them to express their interest if they would like to share in webinars, in anticipation that we would want to hear about what people are doing and not doing. Of course, that sharing is not limited to those people we invited to the marketplace, but it's maybe a useful starting point. And certainly that would be, I think, very interesting for us to have 1 or 2 webinars even on opportunities to share our own experience, our own work, and what the successes have been and the approaches and that are working well, and where we are finding things are not working so well. but also good to see that we have kind of equal focus. No, the next one then around the interface between science and policy towards climate resilience. Very important, and a lot of what Oblenea was talking about. And then more unpacking. So underlying causes of vulnerability and conflict. What are the drivers and barriers and solutions? How do we change business as usual? And what about the governance issues? So I think that's really interesting. And then we have one other. So that looks like it's the effect of climate change on food and nutrition security, what mitigating strategies could be used. So that's another good one. What are the impacts on food and nutrition security? And then back to the approaches. We recognize there's all sorts of topics here that we could look at in relation to the kind of approaches we have. There's adaptation planning, climate services, multi-stakeholder sort of interaction platforms. There are many, many ways in which we can approach this. But thank you all for sharing your ideas, and we'll take this into account in terms of how we go forward. Of course, we have the webinar tomorrow, so we'll be doing this again, and we'll put the results of the 2 polls together, and then still probably give some opportunity on the mailing list to allow for further sharing of ideas and suggestions, and also contributions that you and the other participants are ready to make. So I think we can go to the next slide, Aurelie, and take down the, I guess we've got the recording from these priority topics, hopefully, I hope. So in terms of, just one second, in terms of the next steps, oops, sorry, let me get rid of that. So yeah, we are out of time. And Michele says, should we do the same poll in all future seminars? Yes, I think so. That would be a good idea. What we'll do immediately is we'll have our French webinar tomorrow. We have people who are presenting the same 2 presentations, but in French, of course. The same questions, discussions. And then we will be posting the webinar recording on the English and French websites. And the presentations are already on the website, so you can find them there. And there's a couple of background papers as well. So for both of those 2 presentations, each of them has a source background paper that you can have a look at for a bit more detail. The outcomes of the discussions, that'll take us a little bit longer because we'll need to pull together from both the webinars and do some work to make something that makes sense in terms of outcomes that we can then share to the full mailing list, whether or not people manage to join the webinars. We've done a bit of sharing on ideas for the next webinars. We want to do, we will also come back then afterwards based on the outcome of the polls on some more concrete ideas for what those next webinars could be. And we'd like to also know from you what sort of timing. So we have a final little poll, a very quick one. What would be the ideal frequency for such webinars? Once every month or less often, because we won't manage more often than that. So very quickly, if you could just jump straight into your thoughts. Okay, one more person, otherwise we'll close it there. Okay, so once every month looks like we are keen on once every month, and we'll try for that. But we would also love to hear from you in terms of other ideas, webinars is one thing. I'm personally happy with the way it worked today. We would, just in the last couple of minutes, if you would like to share any feedback in the chat box on how you felt it went today in terms of the, using polls and group work and presentations, take the last seconds to throw in any feedback you have into the chat box, and otherwise we're happy to receive feedback by email as well. You have our email addresses. Everyone has now the full mailing list, and we'd also encourage to share ideas and publication links, things that relate to these discussions that we're just starting now, so we can continue to discuss together virtually while we need to. And then from our side, we'll continue discussing options for a face-to-face meeting. We have no idea at this point, but more than likely we are probably talking early 2021 rather than late 2020. But that one we'll continue to discuss, and again, your suggestions on that or information on any other events that relate to this that you could share with us would be great. Otherwise, thank you so much to everybody for joining today. I've really enjoyed. I hope you have as well. Very rich discussion, and yeah, let's continue learning and sharing with each other, and start co-creating some new insights and ideas and influence on the way we do our work in the Sahel. Thank you again to everybody, and we'll close here. All the best, and see you next time.
Thanks, Fiona. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Oble, are you here?
Yes.
Can you join tomorrow's webinar in French? I think you speak both French and English. Is it okay?
Yeah, tomorrow I will try to join you, but I have a staff.
Oh, really? Okay,
Oble will join when you can, and if you can, that's great, and if you can't, it's fine too.
Yeah, because we had an interesting group discussion, and then I think if tomorrow you can join, it will be an add value for us. That will be great.
Yes, thanks for appreciating. I will try, because I think it's possible that I join at 11, because our meeting will start at 10.
Ah, okay.
We'll be organized from our headquarters in Accra, and we will be following by WebEx in Ouaga. So I can excuse myself. I think even if the meeting is not done at 11, I'll talk to my manager. I think it will be possible to join you at 11.
Okay, looking forward to hear from you.
Thank you, Sanusi. Looking forward to it.
Okay, good.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Okay, Fiona, Aurelie, is Sebastian is gone? Sebastian?
Hi, sorry, this is Kofi.
Ah, okay, Kofi.
What would the briefing be? What time?
Okay.
I think Aurelie saying like at 1 hour, on the hour, an hour from now, whatever time you are. Is that right, Aurelie?
Yeah, if that's possible for all of you, but
so like for me, so for Aurelie, that's 3 o'clock. So for Sanusi, that's 2 o'clock. For Kofi, that's 1 o'clock. The most important is, I think for me and Aurelie, in terms of because we are swapping facilitation and all the technologies and all that. And then otherwise, it would be useful maybe for Yusuf and Awais But I think, and Sanusi. So, I mean, mainly we need Sanusi, Aurelie, and me to figure out how to go ahead tomorrow. But Kofi, if you have any immediate feedback right now you want to share rather than joining the debrief, it's up to you. You're welcome to join later, or because you won't be joining us tomorrow, and mainly it's this particular debrief is just to make sure we're set for tomorrow.
Right. Thank you. I think I would excuse you then.
Yeah.
I had another meeting, so I was hoping to maybe get
yeah, that's fine. But otherwise, Kofi, fantastic. It went really well. It was really good. I guess the thing that didn't quite come out, but it came out in the chat box anyway, was like this information is useful for our work, and we'll have time to go in more into that in future as well. But no, it was great. I mean, both you and Sebastian, Dr. Time, to the point, very clear. It was great. Thank you. Thank you, really.
Thank you too.
I guess you could just check in with Yusuf in case he has any issues or questions he wants to discuss. Otherwise, I think he's good to go for tomorrow.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll follow up with him. I wish you well tomorrow too.
Great. And thanks a lot. And we'll be in touch.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Bye then.
Bye. Okay. Then let's see in 15 minutes. That is it.
Yeah.
50 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah.
50 minutes from
okay.
Yeah.
That's very good discussion. I think I really appreciate the group discussions.
Yep.
Yeah. Me too.
Very good.
And I went back to all the groups, and everybody was discussing.
Oh,
fantastic.
I visited all of them. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Talk to you soon.
See you. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Bye.